Let me introduce you. Welcome back to Stanford Classical Liberalism Seminar. I'm very delighted to introduce Jesús Fernández-Villaverde, Professor of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests are in the formulation of dynamic equilibrium models, their efficient computation, and their estimation, in particular using machine learning. Jesús' research has shaped both academic debates and real-world policy conversations. A public intellectual, engaging broader audiences on economic history, political philosophy, medieval philosophy even, and institutions that sustain a free and prosperous society. Today, he will speak on the demographic future of humanity. Welcome, Jesús.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me here, even if virtually. Hopefully next time we can do it in person and I can enjoy of the good California weather. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, this very good. So I'm going to give you a talk. It's based on a couple of keynote addresses I have given in a couple of conferences lately. They have been well received, so I was invited to submit it as a paper for the annual review of economics. And I was actually offered a contract by Harvard University Press to make them into a book. So any type of feedback, even if just about, how to organize the material in ways that are more successful, please let me know and I will be very, very thankful. So I want to start with 3 facts about global demographics. Fact number 1 is that the drop in global TFR is faster than you think. So let me first tell you what TFR is. It's just the total fertility rate. I will be a little bit more careful in just 1 second to explain exactly how we define it. And the reason why this...
So do you want to do full screen?
Oh, didn't I do full screen yet?
No, but it's okay. Yeah. We can see it, but if you prefer.
You see well?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay. And the reason why the drop in global fertility is much faster than you think is because of 2 mechanisms. The first one is that TFR drop accelerated around 2016. So, if you ask me, someone who has been following economic growth and population for the last 30 years, everyone knew that TFR was dropping, but the really interesting thing is that it accelerated a lot around 2016. And the second reason why a lot of people is not fully aware of where we are is because the United Nations World Population Prospect data, which is the one that most people are using, especially in sociology and demographics, is seriously flawed. And I will try to convince you that this is in fact the case. And this drop in fertility has been so fast that according to my calculations, and I will try to convince you that my calculations are actually quite on the cautious side, 2023 was likely the first year in human history when fertility rate, the TFR, fell below replacement. That is the amount of children that we need per woman to keep population constant over time. And the interesting thing is that we have never seen this before, not even during wars or pandemics. So even during World War I or World War II, where people didn't want to have a lot of children, we were always well above replacement. And the same for pandemics. Now, before I move on, I need to make a warning. I will define lately carefully what total fertility rate is, but think about it at this moment as just an estimate of how much or how many children a woman will have given current observed fertility rates. But that's different from completed cohort fertility rate, which is the number of children that a woman actually did have by the end of her childbearing years. The problem with completed fertility is that nearly by definition, we can only learn about it with a big lag. So right now we are in 2025. We usually define the end of fertility age by 45. So it means that we only know the completed fertility rate of women who were born in 1980 or before. And because of this difference, you can have a little bit of a divergence between total fertility rate and completed cohort fertility rate. This graph is for Sweden. In red, you have the total fertility rate. In blue, you have the completed cohort fertility rate. But I will come back to that later. The point I want you to get out of here is that the difference between the two is not going to be as large as you will need to undo most of what I want to say today. There is just no way these two things can be big enough to undo my main statements. And the third thing that I want you to keep in mind is that not only total fertility rate is dropping faster than you think, not only we are probably already below fertility rate, and remember, I'm emphasizing here the whole planet, not just advanced economies, there is a lot of strong evidence that middle and poor income countries are experiencing faster demographic transitions than advanced economies. So what I mean is at this moment, think about countries in Asia or Africa or Latin America are experiencing a demographic transition in the same way that the US or Western Europe experienced 50 years ago, 100 years ago. What we are seeing is that that demographic transition is being much faster than before, and that they are overshooting advanced economies in terms of fertility decline. That is, that the level at which these countries seem to be stabilizing in terms of fertility levels, some of them we have not even seen any sign of stabilization yet, but for the ones that we have seen some stabilization, they are clearly overshooting and stabilizing at a much lower fertility rates than rich economies. So, as I always emphasize, the issue to keep in mind here, in some sense, is not why fertility rate in the US is so low, but why fertility rates in the US are so high, given everything else that we are seeing. Okay. These three facts, which I will try to document carefully, have three clear consequences. The first clear consequence is that peak birth was around 2012. So by peak birth, I mean the year in the history of humanity where more children were born. That was 2012, with around 138 million people being born in that year. Since then, births have been falling a lot, and right now we are probably around 124 million. Okay, so the cohort, the world cohort, has already been reduced from around 138 million to 124 million. The United Nations thinks that there is going to be a rebound in births over the next decade, not because the rates are going to grow, but because the cohort of women moving into fertility is going to be larger. I disagree with that forecast, and I will try to convince you that this is in fact a flawed forecast. So I think that peak birth is behind us, and we are never going to go back to 138 million births per year, well, at least not in the foreseeable future. Now, once you are below replacement rate, as I was mentioning before, since the year 2023, that means that eventually the population is going to start falling. And that's going to happen around the year 2055. Why do you have this around 30 years of extra population growth? Basically, because what you have are very large previous cohorts that are going to be having children, and because now people live for many years, there is going to be this transitional period where the older individuals have not died yet, but the new generation has already been born. This is called in demographics a momentum. A momentum usually lasts between 15 to 30 years, so I'm going to be cautious and think it's going to last for around 30 years. But it may well be the case that population growth in the planet will start falling before 2055. And this is going to have many consequences. Some of them can be positive, and this is not going to be a talk about we are doomed, the planet is about to end and the human species is about to disappear. Some of the consequences can be good, but I also need to be open about the fact that some of the consequences can be quite bad. And in particular, I want to emphasize that the present today of Japan and the way in which the Japanese economy have been performing over the last 20 years or so is really a preview of a lot of the ways in which the rest of the world economy is going to work. And this is going to be just a direct consequence of having a very, very low fertility rate. Okay, if there is any question at this moment, I see something on the chat. Okay, so someone is asking, why is the source of your data and why is it better than the UN data? So I'm going to come back to that later on. I'm going to be using the data of countries with national statistical agencies that I assess as being highly professional. Okay, so which countries do I think that have statistical agencies that are highly professional? Denmark, Sweden, Norway. I'm not going to be looking at the strange countries. And the really amazing thing is that what the United Nations claims about population in Denmark is very different what that the Danish say is happening in Denmark. And you will see in a second the big differences that that implies. So I'm not going to be using any type of strange data, survey, anything like that. Okay, so let me first, before I move on, let me spend just 5 minutes telling you something that is actually something that every undergraduate learns when you take a course in demographics. I took Introduction to Demographics as an undergrad, but surprisingly enough, I realized that many people either have forgotten or if you are an economist, you may have never seen. And is the global replacement rate is not 2.1. So remember, I was telling you before that the total fertility rate, TFR, is going to be the average number of children that will be born to a woman over her lifetime if she were to experience the current age-specific fertility rate throughout her lifetime and she were going to live between ages 15 and 44. So as I was saying before, we basically look at how many children are 15-year-old women in the US having right now, how many children are 16-year-old women, how many children 20, 21, all the way up to 44. We sum all of that, and that gives us an estimate of the average number of children that an American woman will have if she were going to follow the current cross section. And the reason why we care about this total fertility rate, as I was mentioning before, is because it tells us whether or not a population is above or below the replacement rate. And the replacement rate is whether or not we have enough children to sustain current population levels, ignoring net immigration. Now, you have probably seen many, many times on the media, you open the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they are always going to say that that replacement rate is 2.1. Yes and no. So let me tell you first how we compute the replacement rate, and then we will see why the story is a little bit more complicated at just 2.1. The replacement rate is a fraction. In the numerator, we have 1 plus the sex ratio at birth. The natural sex ratio at birth among humans is 1.05. That means you take a population and you are going to have around 105 births of boys for each 100 births of girls. So 1 plus the sex ratio basically tells you, how many births do we need to have one woman. And then in the denominator, we put the probability of a woman to survive to 30, which is the midpoint of her lifetime fertility. And the idea is that in that way we capture the probability that this woman that has been born in the numerator will actually move on to have children on her own. Now, this is just an approximation because the exact formula involves like an integral over fertility during your whole life, but the approximation is pretty good. So let's look at an advanced country like the US. I mentioned before that sex ratio at birth among humans is around 1.05 without outside intervention. So in the numerator, we are going to have 205. The probability of a woman to survive to 30 in the US is roughly 98%. A few women die of some tragic accidents or illnesses, but nearly everyone gets to 30. And that gives us the 2.1 that I was mentioning before. Turns out to be the case that while this is true for the United States, it's not true for a lot of emerging countries. So let's take the case of Pakistan. In Pakistan, the first thing that you need to notice is that the sex ratio at birth is not 1.05, but actually higher, around 1.10. Let me show you a map of sex ratios at birth across the world. You have China, 115. You have India and Pakistan, 110. Why do you have this? Of course, because since the arrival of ultrasound technology, and since these societies have a strong preference for boys over girls, there is a lot of selective abortions. And what you can see is that since China, India, Pakistan, Vietnam, etc., are such large share of the world population, that's going to change the global replacement rate. However, if you go to the Americas, pretty much every country is at 105, which is what we will expect. Now, the second reason why Pakistan is different is because the probability of a woman to survive to 30 is actually much lower. It's only around 0.9. And when you put these things two together, you get that the replacement rate for Pakistan is a much higher 2.33. You do this country by country, and then you aggregate using the number of births that we are having in the planet, and that gives you in each country, and that gives you that the replacement rate for humanity is 2.2. Now, it may not seem like a big difference, 2.2 in respect to 2.1, but this is a little bit like in finance. This is something that is going to be cumulative over years, so just a small difference has a very, very long impact. Okay, so keep in mind the replacement rate for humanity is around 2.2, is not 2.1. Everyone got that? Okay, very good. So let me tell you about fact number one, the fact that I documented at the beginning, the fact that I mentioned in my introduction. And that one is the drop in global TFR. I'm going to criticize later the data from the United Nations, but at this moment, before I do that, just let's take the data at face value. This is the total fertility rate that the United Nations has computed for the last 12 years. Each color represents a different revision of the data. And what you can see over there is that if we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, the total fertility rate of the world was around 5. And that was the time where people were writing books like The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, your colleague at Stanford, saying that the planet was going through a very, very fast population growth. And, at face value, those statements made some sense. But what most demographers were already saying by the time that Ehrlich wrote his book is that there were very clear signs that fertility rate was dropping very, very fast. Okay, and you can see how we were dropping like this. But also, by the year 2000, you could see this slowdown. And imagine, so I graduated in Minnesota in 2001. Imagine you stopped me in 2001. I already was working on demographics, and you asked me, what do you think is going to happen? I will have said, well, we are going to continue having this gentle decline, and that's going to mean that we are going to probably be above replacement rate still by the year 2100. And that's what most people, and that was the consensus at the time. Okay, and you can see, for instance, the green line is what people were forecasting as late as 2017, or the United Nations was forecasting. Let me zoom in this part of the data. This is what you see over here. And what you see, as I was mentioning before, is that more or less, according to the United Nations, there is this big drop in fertility, this acceleration in the drop, let me be precise, around the year 2016 or so. So instead of having this gentle decline, what we have had over the last 10 years or so is a much, much faster decline. And according to the United Nations, we are already around 2.25, and they argue that we will continue declining. The magenta line is the latest revision into 2024. So if the replacement rate for the planet is 2.2, according to the United Nations, we will cross that in 2029. I told you that according to my calculations, we already did it in 2023. And you will see in a second why that is the case, or why I make that argument. But what I want you to keep in mind at this moment is that I'm not telling you a complete different picture of the world, okay? It's not that I'm saying the data is so bad that it's completely useless. Even if you agree with the United Nations, we are only talking about a difference of 6 years. So we are going to be fighting today about the second decimal, not about the first decimal. And that's important to keep in mind. This is a map of the United Nations, where countries are below replacement rate, defined as 2.1, just to make things simpler. And you can see that pretty much all Europe, most of Asia, and nearly all of the Americas are already below replacement rate. This map, in fact, is, as I will try to argue, has way too much red. A lot of the countries in red should be blue already, but I'm going to make that point in just 1 second. Okay, so I have been saying from the beginning that I'm very skeptic about the United Nations World Population Prospect 2024 data. And I could make this case in a lot of detail. And in fact, I'm working with my co-author, Patrick Norrick, on a paper where we are planning to document this in a lot of detail. But I have 4 main reasons. Reason number 1 is large discrepancies between vital registries and the United Nations. So what are vital registries? In most countries, what you have is some type of civil registry when you need to register a birth once it has happened. And some countries do not keep very detailed civil registries, but most countries by now keep civil registries that the United Nations assess as being more than 99% accurate. Okay? So the United Nations tells you that they believe that 99% of births in Colombia are registered properly. And when you talk with people in Colombia, with DANE, the local National Institute of Statistics, they say, yes, we believe that in fact more than 99% of births are registered properly. Let me show you that these differences between what the vital registries are telling you and what the United Nations is telling you is happening are very large. And I'm going to show you the example of Colombia. I'm only going to plot 2 years of the vital statistics, not to crowd the graph too much, but I could draw the whole thing. What you see over there is the red line are the annual births that the United Nations thought were happening in 2022. Okay, so they basically say, we believe in 2000, as the information set of 2022, we believe that there were this many births in 2015. In 2014, in 2024, they say, no, we actually thought there were like 50,000 less births. Let's move to today. This is what the United Nations thinks is happening in Colombia. This is what the Colombian National Institute of Statistics is saying. And if you go to 2024, you see this tremendous drop. Now, the United Nations by this moment is already in forecast, but I only put it to kind of give you a sense of how far away their forecast is from observations. We are not talking about small differences. According to the United Nations, there were slightly over 700,000 births in Colombia, and according to their vital registries, there were a little bit over 500,000. So we are talking about differences of 50%. And by the way, all these registries register total number of births. They don't register total number of nationals' births. So that includes migrants, for instance, for Venezuela. Yes. Someone had a question? Okay. Turns out to be the case that Colombia is not a unique case. We go over the data and we find that in over 50% of the countries for which we have data from statistics, vital statistics from the country that we can put a lot of confidence, the differences are very large. This, for instance, is for Turkey, and this, for instance, is from Egypt, when we are again talking about over 400,000 births a year. And you can see how the United Nations thinks that births are actually increasing in Egypt, when in fact, we see that they are decreasing. And what is really surprising is not only that you have this discrepancy, is that there is a bias in the discrepancy. The United Nations always says there are many more births than the other way around, that the ones in the vital registries. We do not find cases where the United Nations says, oh, there are 50,000 births less. And remember, these are countries for which the United Nations claims, this is the craziness. The United Nations says in the same document, we believe vital registries are registering at least 99% of births, but we actually think there are 50% more births than in the vital registries. This is just logical inconsistency. You see my point? Now, they have, okay, so this is for what we think is in the data. They also have a strange forecast. Now, of course, strange forecast, how do you judge whether or not something is a strange forecast? Okay, let me show you. This is India, and I'm going to pick India first because it's the country right now in the world with the largest population. Continuous red line is what the United Nations thinks has been the total number of births in, the fertility rate in India based on the number of births that they claim it happened. And what you very, very clearly see is that in the moment it goes to discontinuous, which is projection, it stabilizes. Okay. Now, how much do we believe that? Not that much, because we are seeing fertility dropping already a lot in India, and that the drop is continuous. The United States. So continuous line is what we have observed. And then as soon as they stop the projection, the historical data, and they start the projection, it actually not only stabilizes, but it recovers a little bit. Will that be the case? I don't know. But this one is hilarious. This one is for China. So this is the data. This is going down. This is the moment where the forecast starts. John, you have taught time series for many years, no? So if I go and I show up this as my final project of my forecast, you probably will not be totally amused. And this is the case for South Korea. So for South Korea, they project that by the year 2100, South Korea will have higher fertility than anything they have had in the last 25 years.
I brought your paper. I fucking paper. Two of them. Man. You could have more education than you ever wanted.
Exactly. So why?
I am Will. Thank you.
Yeah. So why is the United Nations assuming this? Well, there is an official reason and there is a real reason. The official reason is this one. This is what they write. The rebound in future fertility in low fertility countries is consistent with an expectation of continued progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment and improving social and economic opportunities for young people and families, which to me is not a very convincing justification. The real reason is because they use something called a Bayesian hierarchical model. And as most time series models, it has a very strong reversion to the mean. And basically what happens is, given all the data that we have of fertility in East Asia, what the model wants to do as soon as you stop the fitting the data and start looking at projection is a return to the mean. And since the mean in East Asia is around 1.3, that's what it wants to do. That's what the model it wants to do. Now, there is a little bit more of a subtle point over here, which is conditional versus unconditional forecast. Maybe this already embeds the idea that, in fact, as they say over here, South Korea is going to do something radical to improve its fertility. But if I'm going to come up with a scenario about where the world population is going to be, to me, it's a little bit hard to believe that this is the baseline scenario that I should use. Okay, it's perfectly fine to recognize that you have that scenario, that this scenario is possible, but it's very hard for me to use it as my baseline. And then just for amusement, something that we did was to check that according to the United Nations, the net number of migrants into the planet is positive for most years. Now, it's not a lot. For instance, it's around 5,000 in the early 2040s. But, wait until we tell President Trump and he starts building a wall against the earth. Okay?
Can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
Yeah, no, how useful are these sort of time series projections? Because, if we go back to early, maybe he was justified. He was just using maybe a naive time series projection.
Yes.
And, he thought the world would explode. Right? Should we use time series projections at all?
No, so my point is, look, I think it's reasonable to try to lay down scenarios with reasonable amounts, with reasonable probability, attached to them, but I think one needs to be very, very open about how limited our understanding of fertility dynamics is. And my complaint is not as much that they assume this enormous rebound in fertility, but that the United Nations, first of all, buries the technical reason why this is happening in Appendix AC, footnote 3, and second, that they don't inform policymakers that their forecasts about the future are really reflecting this prior belief that we are going to rebound to average, we are going to revert to the mean. Okay? And this is important because in many, many countries, policy decisions are based on the statements by the United Nations. And in many policy institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, where they are building models, they always use the United Nations World Population Prospect data, especially for the future. When we are doing things like, for instance, climate change as integrated assessment models, all those integrated assessment models have this forecast about what is going to happen with China total fertility rate. And if we are going to make policy decisions, look, I understand that forecasting the future is very difficult, but at least you need to understand that you are buying in a lot, but a lot of assumptions. This is not, look, saying that China total fertility rate is going to revert to the mean is not quote unquote science. It's a reasonable assumption, but it's not the gravitational constant that we can go and measure out there. It's just an assumption. And it's fine with me if you want to tell me this is an assumption, but tell me it's an assumption. Don't tell me that you have the best demographers in the world and they know the future. You see the point I'm trying to make? And then what worries me a little bit more is the following. Well, one worries me a lot, two a little bit, three is the systematic bias in revisions. So let me show you the following. Okay, so imagine that you pick up the World Population Prospect in 2015. In that year, the United Nations was telling us that the world population was not going to peak before 2100. They always stop their forecast in the year 2100. And in that year, the world population was going to be 11.2 billion people. 2 years later, they were saying the same, but they took out 33 million people. Not a big deal. Now, look at what starts happening in 2019. Remember I told you that we start seeing this big decrease in fertility around 2016. So the first year where you see the drop in fertility in the data of the United Nations, they are still saying that we are not peaking, but they are already taking out 300 million people from the forecast. So for the first time in their forecast, we are never getting to 11 billion. Surprise, surprise, in 2022, for the first time, the United Nations talks about a peak. So according to the United Nations in 2022, the world population will peak in 2086 at 10.43 million. Look, this is a huge difference. It's over 400 million. And in the very latest revision, 2024, they forecast the peak in 2084 at 10.289, a little bit less than 10.3 billion. And in 2100, the end of the forecast is 10.180. If you compare this with their forecast just 9 years before, they have basically taken out from the forecast a little bit more than 1 billion people. Why is this such a gigantic number? Because remember, the world population is a stock, it's not a flow. So taking out 1 billion from a stock is a gigantic amount of revision. And in fact, if I had a little bit more time, I will show you that the only reason they were able to just take 140 million between here and only push the future peak for 2 years is because they did something absolutely crazy with the forecast for Egypt and the forecast for Yemen. They basically think that Yemen is going to have 400 million people in the year 2100, which is absolutely impossible. Okay? But you can see very clearly that I was telling you before that my forecast is 2055, the United Nations is 2084. So we are not that different. And you will see in a second why that's actually quite relevant. But the point is, you cannot be in a situation where in each revision, you take out people from your forecast. If you are doing this systematically, it means that you are not building your forecast properly. Okay, it cannot be the case you have a bias in the forecast. Now, the last point why I don't quite believe the data is that probably there are fewer people in the planet than we think. And these are called differences in levels. So over the last 3 years, something interesting has happened in Latin America. For the first time, we undertook censuses done with the same level of technical accuracy that censuses done in North America and Western Europe. This was largely due to the fact that the European Union gave a lot of money to these countries and a lot of technical support. And now you have all these people knocking at doors asking for questions with like iPads, so they can notepads, so they can actually keep track of everything much better than before, when previous censuses used to have a lot of corrections for undercounting. What we have discovered that in Brazil turns out to be the case, there are not 12 million Brazilians, there are only 203 million. In Paraguay, it's not 6.9, it's only 6.1. And again, I'm always talking about residents. Whether or not you are a national or an immigrant, legal or illegal immigrant, is absolutely irrelevant over here. Okay? So it turns out to be the case that just correcting for the fact that there are 9 million Brazilians less, the peak of humanity is not going to be 2084, it's 2081. Now, I suspect, but I want to emphasize the word suspect, okay? I want to be very clear, I want to be very honest, and I want to be very humble. This is a suspicion, this is a conjecture, this is a hypothesis, that these level effects are going to be present in many other countries, in particular in Africa. The first time that we are going to measure things properly in sub-Saharan Africa, we are going to be surprised, that's my conjecture, that there is going to be much fewer people than we thought they were. Why? Because at this moment, aggregate data for Africa is really bad. Okay? And this is really funny. The United Nations says, oh, we forecasted 10 years ago that there were going to be 8 million birds in Nigeria. And then you look at the data today and they say, oh, how many birds happen in Nigeria? 8 million. Oh, our forecast was great. No, they are just using their forecast as the data. What has happened? Well, it turns out to be the case that in North Africa, we already have quite good vital statistics. And in particular over there, you have Egypt and Tunisia being with very, very low fertility rates and falling very fast. Now, it's North Africa, it's not Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm aware of it, but that tells me there is going to be a little bit of a contagion going down. Turns out to be the case there are two countries in Africa for which we have a little bit better data, which are Lesotho and Kenya. Both countries are having big drops in fertility, much faster than anyone would have expected. Lesotho is probably already below replacement rate. Kenya, Nairobi metropolitan area is probably already below replacement rate already. Okay, these are based on surveys. And the last point I wanted to say, and that kind of links a little bit what I was saying before about Brazil, is that forecasting the peak of a concave function is really, really hard. So what do I mean by that? This is the forecast in blue of the United Nations for world population, and you can see how it peaks over here in the year 2084. But it's basically flat for many, many years. And that's why even very, very small differences in population will put you all the way here. Remember, I'm 2025, I'm over here. Okay, I think we are going to peak over there, probably on about 10 billion, perhaps never reaching 10 billion. So even very, very minor differences with respect to the United Nations will put you in 2055. So just to emphasize a point I already mentioned before, I'm not forecasting anything crazy. Okay, I'm just saying I play with the second decimal of everything that the United Nations says. I just correct for countries where I have good data, and I get a very different scenario than the United Nations. But for instance, for Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm taking the United Nations at 100% face value. And the reason for that is because I want to convince you that this is not because I'm playing funky business with Nigeria or with Kenya. My data for Kenya and my data from Nigeria are the United Nations data. What I'm doing is I'm taking out the Colombian data from the United Nations, which I don't think makes any sense, and I'm putting the Colombian data, the Colombian National Institute of Statistics data. And I'm doing that with around 30 to 40 countries. I'm not assuming this crazy rebound in fertility in South Korea. I'm assuming a much gentler rebound. And I get that the population will be peaking in 2055. Okay, so let's put all this together. So correcting for excess births, like the ones I was telling you in Turkey or Egypt or Colombia, the total fertility rate in 2024 is around 217. This is what I estimate, instead of the 225 that the United Nations is saying. Okay, so as I was saying before, I'm only changing the second decimal. I'm going from 225 to 17. But the world replacement rate, I already told you a few slides before, was 2.2 approximately. Well, if I give you the second decimal, 221. And that's why I say that we are already below replacement rate and that peg birth is behind us. Now, if this was a paper that I'm submitting to a top journal, I will have a few tables with robustness analysis and slightly different assumptions and all the type of extremely boring things that you need to do to get the paper through the finish line with an editor. But the only point you need to take home today is that I'm going to be talking about all the ranges of my TFR is going to be between 215 and 219. And in fact, most of the uncertainty is on the downside, not on the upper side. I think it's nearly impossible that the fertility rate of the planet right now is above 219. I just don't see any way it can be, but I can actually see it's much lower than 2.17 if we are really, really messing up the data with Africa. Okay, now this is very interesting because actually my scenario is nearly a carbon copy of the low fertility scenario from the World Population Prospects from 2024. The United Nations publishes 3 scenarios. The one they give to the journalist, and that's the one you will read in the New York Times. And then they publish what they call a low fertility scenario and a high fertility scenario. If you actually ask me, I think the low fertility scenario and my scenario are nearly the same. And I don't know. I don't want to attribute other people's beliefs. I actually think that the demographers of the United Nations think that the low fertility scenario is the most plausible one. And before you ask, what do I think they keep their baseline scenario as such a scenario for much higher births and much higher fertility? I think that the United Nations Population Division has spent 60 years saying there is a population bomb in the planet. Now that population bomb doesn't exist anymore. We are going on the opposite direction, and they find it's extremely difficult to change tax right now, to start saying something completely different from what they have said for 60 years. That will have a lot of credibility cost. It will have a lot of credibility problems. There is a huge amount of people, that institutions, foundations, blah, 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 that spent a lot of time and effort talking about the population bomb. When I started, actually, I have only been canceled once in my life, and it was because I was going to give this talk at Colorado, and the demographers in Colorado say, no, you cannot give this talk. Despite the fact that I was going to give it at the Department of Economics, and they say, no, this is completely crazy. And by the way, the argument they use is because if you come to this talk, you can come up with the conclusion that I'm against abortion, or that someone may decide to switch and be against abortion. I thought that was an absolutely, I can tell you later a little bit about what happened. But the point I'm trying to make—
There are some questions, if you're willing to take questions.
Sorry.
Jonathan.
No, go ahead. Oh,
yeah, okay. Let me just ask you the following. So I have a friend who's not an economist, who did something incredibly simple, and he claimed the world population is a—
Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
So you looked at world—
Sorry,
No, you're cutting off.
I cannot hear you. I don't know if this is my problem or.
No, it's Jonathan. I guess.
Shows a decline.
Jonathan, we cannot hear you. Can you repeat your question?
Yeah. Okay. Hold on. No, it should be okay. All right. So my question is this. I have a friend who believes the world population. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
So I have a friend who believes the world population has reached a peak already. We're on the decline. And the reason he believes this is he looked at correlates. He, like you, doesn't believe the United Nations numbers.
Yeah.
And he looked at correlates. So he looked at world energy usage, food usage, all the correlates with population. And looking at those correlates, he concluded that the world population is declining. Question, has anybody really done this formally?
Not to the best of my knowledge. I will need to look at those correlates to gauge how much I trust that statement.
Well, it's things like world energy usage.
Yes, but the thing is, the US uses way less energy now than in 1980.
Yeah, but I don't think that's true in the third world. But what about food?
Yeah, but again, food is so difficult to measure that it's kind of hard to tell.
It's a lot easier to measure than population. I mean, this is like, I mean, look, these correlates, it seems to me the correlates are more reliable than the United Nations, is completely politically driven.
Yeah. Okay, so let me put it in this way. I think I have high confidence in my ability to count the number of people in the Americas, from Tierra del Fuego to Alaska. That population is still growing, even discounting net migration into the Americas. Population in Europe is growing because immigration. So for the world population to decrease, you will need that population in Africa is actually falling. And I think that's a bridge too far for me. If you tell me that population in Africa is growing much more slowly than what the United Nations says by an order of magnitude, that I will believe. That total population in Africa is going down. I just don't see that. I really don't see that. So.
John, and then John Hartley.
Yeah. John?
Okay. I'm okay. So my question, Jesus, this is a great presentation, is really about policy and what you think about baby bonuses. There's some places in like Flint, Michigan, for example, in Michigan that are paying families $7,500 over the span of less than a year, starting in the third trimester. What do you think of something like, I have a paper on that for what it's worth. Those things, there is evidence that these things increase fertility. There's been others done around the world. I'm curious, like also just as sort of a theoretical point too, is it maybe a second best policy? I know there's a lot of free market classical liberal people here, but there's this challenge which, there's a lot of evidence that the rising cost of living, zoning's making it prohibitively difficult to have children. I don't think we're solving the zoning issue anytime soon, given the political economy problem of people aren't going to vote against their housing values. I'm curious what you think about this as a policy issue.
Okay, so first of all, I have a slide later when I tell you about some of the economic impact, and I was planning to talk about that later on. By and large, I think that issues like changing in houses and education policy give you a lot of results. They really have an impact on fertility that is measurable and that is meaningful. Giving $2,500 to someone for having a children has close to zero effect. And the good thing about issues such as reforming housing and education is that they belong to this set of what I call no regret policies. Look, we need more housing in the US. We need more housing in the Western world. If we let more houses to be built and it turns out to be the case doesn't have much of an impact on fertility, we don't really lose much because we need the houses anyway. The same with education reform. Now, if it doesn't fit the problem of population, then we need to go back to the much more meaningful or the much more difficult question about how we are going to adapt. The second point that you are saying is, well, Jesus, but what if we cannot fix housing and we cannot fix education? then my counter argument will be, I don't think $2,500 is going to make any difference. So we are just going to waste the money. But if you don't terribly mind, can I hold that question and come back to that a little bit later?
Sure.
Okay. John Cochran.
Yeah, I want to put in a chit on objecting to the we need to subsidize because we don't understand what happened. In the 1950s, people had lots of kids without free childcare, without free subsidized housing. They lived in tiny houses. In Africa, they have lots of kids and they lived in, little villages. So the idea that modern Americans aren't having kids because it's too expensive to have a house is just, well, it's a little bit whining and it's a little bit ahistorical. But I want to ask, turning the economics, really, we don't have a good idea what happened.
Yeah.
But there is a biological argument, which I want to know what you have in the data. The data question is, how much variability across subgroups is there and how heritable is it? Because, of course, biology is, my guess it's going to be very long mean reversion. But once everybody who has one kid per generation dies off, the people who have 2 and 3 are going to inherit the planet. The question is, how long does that take? How much variation is there? How heritable is it?
Yeah, I know. I'm going to show you a fun. Let me see over.
You can wait on this if you want.
No, of course, no. But I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you something that I saw sometimes because since I have my computer over here. Oh, okay. So this is my joke when people ask me that question. So I asked ChatGPT to draw a president of the United States in 2022, the year 2200. And my claim is that he's going to be Amish because they are the only ones who are going to have kids by then. So yes, this is going to have a big impact. And I will come back to that. This is going to have a big impact on the distribution of groups within society. And we know that actually a lot of these fertility predispositions or norms actually have quite a bit of persistence. And a point I have made in a couple of articles and posts on Twitter is that precisely when fertility is so low, that you have that very small differences in fertility compound into very, very big changes in population composition very quickly. So if you're in a world where, let's say, conservatives are having 4.5 children and liberals are having 4 children, there is not much change in the composition of the population in a couple of generations. Imagine that the persistence is 100%. If you are conservative, your children is always conservative and the other way around. But if you're in a world where conservatives have gone down to 2, but liberals have gone down to 1.2, which is roughly what we have in the US right now, you are completely changing the composition of the US population in 2 generations. And the best example is Ireland. In 1922, Northern Ireland, the 6 counties of Ulster are created at Northern Ireland. And at that time, 70% of the population was Protestant. That's why Northern Ireland was created, and 30% was Catholic. And here I'm going to use Protestant as Catholic as they use it in Northern Ireland, which is just your social group. Whether or not you went to church on Sunday is a little bit irrelevant. In the latest census, a couple of years ago, Catholics for the first time were a majority, 51%. And that's why yes.
The Hoover donors are full of conservatives whose kids have all turned to progressive Democrats. So how persistent it is, of course.
Yes, I know. But actually, no, that's actually a very interesting thing. The kids of rich people tend to drift left, but the kids of religious, observant, poor Protestants tend to remain observant, poor Protestants. And there are many more of those. There are many, many more of those. So, and I think that people have already doing numbers, and it's quite a bit of a change. But I give you the point. Persistence is the big game over here. Okay, so let me tell you then about fact 3. And fact 3, if you remember, is that we are having faster and faster demographic transitions, but also deeper. Okay, so this graph is just a stylized description of what I'm trying to say. Okay, this doesn't come, well, it does come from a model, but it's not based on a complete record of what we have seen in the planet so far. Okay, so we calibrate the model until like time 5, the rest are the implications of the model. But I think the data is supporting what we are seeing so far. The blue line is what I think is going to be the evolution of fertility rate in advanced economies. You start very high, let's say around 5. You drop very early. Think about late 19th century, early 20th century for the United States. And then you more or less stabilize. And the US stabilizes around 1.9 by the early 1970s. And then it has been going up and down a little bit. Recently, it has been going down to 1.6. But remember what I told you about completed versus fertility versus TFR. I actually think that completed fertility for the US is going to be closer to 1.7 to 1.8, which is not that different from the 1.9 of the early 1970s.
Just in 10 seconds, can you tell us what the forces are in this model? What causes it?
Yes. So in this, well, first of all, at this moment, this is my conjecture of what is going to happen in the world. And then I'm going to tell you what the model is. But basically, it's going to be a quantity-quality trade-off Barrow-Becker model with diffusion of technology, where technology starts in England, diffuses over time, and the way in which the diffusion happens through international trade is going to change relative prices, the skill premiums, in such a way that it's going to deliver this thing. Okay? But at this moment, I'm just trying to tell you that this is the way I think the planet is going to go, as a pure description of the facts. Then you have middle-income economies, they start dropping, and when they drop much faster. So think about Spain or Ireland. Fertility starts dropping very, very fast in Spain or Ireland in the 1960s, and it seems to be stabilizing at a lower level than the US. And then we have the low-income economies that start much later, but when they do it really, really fast, and they seem to be stabilizing, if anything, because for most of them, I don't think we have seen the bottom yet, at even lower level. Now, in the model, I replicate this through a Barrow-Becker quality-quantity trade-off with technological diffusion, but that doesn't need to be the only model that can replicate these observations. But in the paper, in the first half of the paper, the fast drop in fertility and the fact that the drops in fertility are becoming faster, that's just data. And I think that data is absolutely uncontrovertible. Whether or not we are going to stabilize at this lower level, the jury is still out. But let me give you a sense of what I have in mind. In this table, I have total fertility rates draw from the statistical agency of each country. So for instance, the United States, this is from the Bureau of Census. And I have picked all these countries based on two characteristics. One, all of them have a TFR lower than the US. Second, all of them are substantially poorer than the US. Additional point, I did not cherry pick. I just ran out of space in the slide. I didn't want to have one of those slides with 8 different tables, with 8 different rows. So US 1.62, Dominican Republic 1.61, Tunisia, Turkey, Iran. I'm putting these 3 because I always ask, what about the Muslim world? No, the Muslim world is going through the same thing, just a little bit later. Mexico, Brazil, Jamaica, Costa Rica, Colombia, Chile, Ivan, you guys are not having any children whatsoever. Thailand. This table to me is just amazing. Okay, I have a bunch of questions. Yes. So someone is asking, Israel is the only OECD country with a positive TFR. Well, let me be a little bit nuanced over there. With TFR above replacement rate. Now, but even in Israel, we are seeing a very, very, very interesting fact. TFR, so Israel, so first of all, let me define carefully what I mean by Israel, because it's going to be defined as the Israeli Statistic Institute defines it, which is the frontiers of Israel in 1948, plus Jerusalem, plus Jewish citizens in the West Bank. So it doesn't include nearly all of the West Bank, it doesn't include Gaza. The very good thing about the Israelis statisticians is that they report the religion of the mother. And not only they report the religion of the mother, they also report measures of intensity of the religion of the mother. So we have data for secular use and non-secular use, and within non-secular use for different groups of non-secular use. Okay, so the fertility of Jewish women has been roughly constant at 3 for the last 30 years or so, which, as you say, is quite unusual or quite unique in any advanced economy. That's a mix of around 3.5 for the more orthodox denominations and around 2 for secular women. And that's really what amazes me, that secular Jewish Israeli women are still at 2.0. You don't see that any other place in the planet. There is no place in the planet where secular women are at 2.0. But within Israel, there is a second group that is going through an immensely fast drop in fertility, which are Muslim Israelis. And again, I want to be very clear. These are not Israelis living in Gaza. These are not Muslims, living in Gaza. These are not Muslims living in the West Bank. These are citizens of Israel who happen to be Muslim. For the first time in 2021, the fertility of Muslim women in Israel dropped below the fertility of Jewish women in Israel. That had never happened since the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. And that's why for the first time since 2022, the percentage of children born from Jewish women is larger than the percentage of Jewish women in the population, and the percentage of Jews within the population in Israel is going to grow over the next 20 years or so, which was always one of the main anxieties of a lot of people in Israel, especially in the 70s and the 80s, where the Muslim fertility was much higher and the proportion of Muslims within Israel was growing. Israel, in that sense, is a completely different game. It will require, if you want one day, I can give you a seminar just on Israel because it's such an interesting case. And I think that a lot of what is happening in Israel right now can be directly linked to these very interesting demographics. Okay, so another question that I have over there is why we should be concerned with the global population rather than individual nations. I'm going to go back to that in a second, I promise. And says, well, it's also okay. Okay, so let me continue. Let me skip this slide. Let me see how I'm doing with time. Let me skip also this one on there's a lot of stuff. We can come back to that. So now let me tell you a little bit about the economics of global population decline. Okay, so I just show you some facts. I think that the facts are relatively uncontroversial if you actually sit down and look at the data without any type of preconception about what is going on. And let me tell you about how I think about this. And like all changes, there are going to be good things and there are going to be bad things. Okay. This is why policy is going to matter. Of course, I go back to the point of John 1 and John 2. This is also going to depend on how we respond to this in terms of policy. And for that, we need some understanding of why we are happening this drop. But, we want to think a little bit some of the basic consequences. Also, I want to highlight that we are venturing into terra incognita. Things can change. This has never happened before. Okay, if you pick any social science textbook from the 1980s or even the 1990s, the main concern was population explosion. And an anecdote that I tell always is that when I was a small kid, I love numbers and I love statistics since I was like 4 years old. Okay, my dad told me I was this extremely annoying kid. He would ask him, what is the production of oil in, Iraq in 1954. And he says, how do I know that? This was the years before Wikipedia. So my parents bought me this book that was full of data and facts. And they have this beautiful graph about Mauritius and how Mauritius was very, very beautiful. But the book stated that population growth in Mauritius was so out of control that this island was doomed. And what I tell people now is Mauritius already has negative population growth. Okay, so things can change very fast. And, I may be completely wrong. And in 25 years, you may remember this talk as Jesus. He was so absolutely and completely wrong. And I'm aware of that, okay? But let me tell you, a couple of books that made similar mistakes in the past. This one, of course, I already mentioned, The Population Bomb. Actually, I reread the book a couple of years ago. The book is really bad. Even given the information set of 1969, the book is really, really bad. I can tell you later why. But this one is quite hilarious. It's Famine 1975, American Decision, Who Will Survive? So what the authors, the Paddocks, were arguing is that by the year 1975, the world will not have enough calories to feed everyone, and that the only country that will have enough extra calories will be the US. So the US had to triage who was going to get the aid. And basically what they propose is that India, we need to write off India. India is not taking seriously its population growth, so India is going to starve to death. And of course, we know that in 2024, not only India is below replacement rate, but India is actually a net exporter of calories. So it's not. But anyway, so first, the good news. And the good news is that if you have a falling population, there is a lot of things that we want to do that may be easier to do. Okay. So for instance, this is a graph that I show when I teach economic history of Latin America. I always show this graph. And I'm trying to explain what inequality in income and wealth means in Latin America. It's a photograph from Brazil. And you can see on one side of the wall, you have the rich, the apartment building for the rich, which they have a jacuzzi in their each terrace, and they have this lap pool over here, and they have tennis courts. And on the other side of the wall, you have these absolutely awful cities. Housing. What happened in Brazil? Well, Brazil, like much of Latin America, had a very, very fast population growth in the 1960s and 1970s, which put so much pressure on their ability to grow the cities, to supply infrastructures, to supply services, that made many Latin American cities quite unpleasant places to live. And now with lower population, a lot of these things can be fixed, okay? Especially if we plan things, before population aging fully takes hold. And, always people ask me, wouldn't this be better for sustainability of natural resources? Yes, we are going to use less energy just because there is fewer people. But the way I also like to think about this is through a very simple decomposition of output that I actually presented at Hoover a couple of years ago, or last year. Think about the basic accounting identity that says that output is equal to labor productivity times labor. Okay, and this is an identity because the left and the right-hand side are equal by definition. Taking logs and derivatives with respect to time, you get that output growth is labor productivity growth plus labor growth. And we can define labor as the number of workers, or we can define labor as the total number of hours worked. But this is kind of a very simple thing to keep in mind. Okay, very good. So the way we were, like the famous movie. This is the US circa 2000. The US has had an average labor productivity growth of around 2%, a little bit less, 1.9, but let's round it up to 2. And what you have over there is that at the time, labor growth in the US was around 1% a year. Around 50% of it was due to the fact that the US still had high population growth and high fertility in the 60s and the 50s, also that women were getting into the labor force, and the other 50% came from the fact that the US still had immigrants like me arriving to the United States. That tells you that on an average year, you are going to grow around 3%. When the economy is doing a little bit better, you are going to be growing at a 4%. When the economy is doing a little bit worse, you are going to grow at a 2%. But this is what I want to tell you. Imagine that we go to the year 2050, and given current population forecast, the US labor growth will fall at around 1% a year. Even if we are able to keep labor productivity growth at a 2%, this means that on an average year, we will grow at a 1%, and there is nothing you can do about it. So the Fed can do as many monetary stimulus as it wants. The federal government can do as many fiscal packages as it wants, but you cannot really get around this very simple equation. And by the way, this is how I started working on this topic a few years ago, trying to think about Japan. And you will see in a second why. Because I was very much against a couple of extremely famous and prominent economists who was saying that the problem of Japan was lack of enough monetary stimulus. And I was just looking at this and I say, how can it be? Okay. So let's go back to Japan. So you pick the Financial Times, you pick the Wall Street Journal, you pick the Economist, and they will always use Japan as the poster child of bad economic performance, or you pick the American Economic Review or the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and you will see one paper after another about the bad economic performance of Japan and some strange reason why that happened. And yes, between 1991 and 2019, I'm going to stop right before COVID. So you don't think anything of this has to do with COVID, but I could do this up to 2024 and I will get exactly the same numbers. GDP in Japan grew at an annual rate of 0.83, much lower than 258 in the US. And that's why people are writing all these articles. So we did the very simple decomposition. And by the way, I need to thank John because he, after my talk at Hoover, recommended me to present the data in this way that is much more graphically appealing. So look, I'm going to take G7 countries, the main economies in the world, plus Spain. Okay, why Spain? Well, first of all, because I'm a Spaniard, and second, because we will be G8. If there is ever a G8, we should be the next to get in. And in the first line, I'm going to do it between 1991 and 2019. Why 1991? Because it's the year where the big fertility drop in Japan that started happening in the late 1960s starts having a meaningful impact on labor force. Okay, before 1991 is too early to make a difference. Why I stop in 2019? I already told you I want to take out the years of COVID just to avoid contamination by different policies of each country regarding the pandemic. Now, what you see in red is in fact the 258 of the US versus the 0.83 of Japan. But what happens if we actually look at GDP per working age adult? And in the paper, we do many different definitions of working age adult to consider, for instance, that in Japan, people work longer years than in the US, or we look at GDP per hour work. Look, this big difference of 1.5 points, a little bit more than 1.5 points, go to a much, much smaller difference. Let's take this in per hour work, 126 versus 153. Per working age adult, considering 15 to 69, 121 to 158. So what is happening? Basically, what is happening in the US was adding population workers around 0.91, was adding hours around 1.04. In Japan, they were falling at around minus 0.5. And in fact, if you take out the first 3 years of the sample, which are the years of the bubble and burst, whatever that means, in Japan, the financial crisis in Japan in the early 1990s, Japan actually has been doing a little bit better than the US. And that's the main lesson I want you to take from this, that if in the future the US, instead of having a growth of working age adults of 0.91, is start to have the drop of 0.54 that Japan has, this 52, 58 is going to transform itself in a slightly above 1. And it cannot be any other way. It cannot be any other way. I mean, fiscal and monetary policy cannot do anything else. But even if we were going to apply very, very aggressive supply side policies, it will be difficult because, as I was saying before, we do not really have a lot of experience of countries growing more than 2% in labor productivity growth a year. And I'm not against, don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm against supply side policies. I'm a big believer in supply side policies. But I also know that supply side policies may get you from 2 to 2.2. They are not going to get you from 2 to 5. Okay?
Jesus,
now,
are there good estimates? This is a quick question. Are there good estimates? If you wanted beta, what would be sort of the optimal fertility rate? Do we have estimates of that, or is that too difficult?
Okay, so that is actually a very difficult question because of 2 reasons. First of all, because you need to take a stand on how we value human lives in your social welfare function. And there is a whole field called philosophy of population that it really implies a lot of moral and ethics, and we can talk about that. Now, I'm going to tell you then a little bit out of my gut, if I may be allowed to do so. I think that for a country like the US, given the current situation, if we could push back our fertility rate to around 1.9, we are fine. This is not going to be a big issue. Yeah, maybe the optimal will be 2, maybe maybe 1.8, but I think anything around 1.9, this becomes a third order consideration for the US. For sure, I think nearly impossible to build a model with any type of meaningful objective function where you value humans, where having a fertility of 0.7 like South Korea has is even close to optimal. Okay. Let me say a couple more things, and I leave time for Q's and A's. So this is very related with the bank question. Don't we care about output per capita? You are going to say, okay, fine, Japan is not growing very fast, so what? GDP per capita is still doing a little bit better. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, output per capita is the primary measure of individual welfare, but our ability to service debt and social security obligations depends on total output. And moreover, and now I need to betray my own political views, if you actually also think that national defense is important, the amount of Navy aircraft task forces that you can keep depends on your total output, not on your output per capita. And finally, keep in mind that we need to redistribute. If we have a very, very aged population, we need to redistribute resources from the young working people to the older working people. And that can only be done with distortionary taxation. So just because you think you have that much output per capita doesn't mean you have the fiscal instruments to move income around. And finally, we have that labor productivity, I think, is unlikely to grow at a 2% any longer, because we know there's a lot of evidence that firm dynamism and new technologies are strongly linked with having a younger population. That most people that create firms are younger people, and that is going to be a little bit, let me skip that, it's going to be a little bit difficult to have really very, very fast productivity growth with a population that is very aged. And that's, by the way, the reason I think that Japan over here is 1.26 instead of 1.53 of the US. This difference is, to me, probably most of it is just aging. Anyway, let me tell you, I have this slide. It's interesting because someone is going to ask about the consequences. This is about a phenomenon called sponge cities. These are the different prefectures in Japan, and you can see that all of them are shrinking in population, some of them more than 1% a year, which is really quite something. And there is one that is growing, which of course is Tokyo. When you have a population that is shrinking, there are more incentives than ever to concentrate in the large city. And I can tell you later if you want in the Q&A why. So don't think that a big drop in population means that New York is going to get empty. It may well mean that that New York grows in size, and that's going to exacerbate the differences in population across the country. Immigrants, let me skip that. I'm actually quite skeptic about the ability to fix this problem with immigration. We were talking already before. John asked me about what type of things that we can do. As I was saying before, and I think someone already mentioned, most of the current drop in TFR below 2.1 in the United States is driven by the extensive margin, not the intensive margin. Okay, so this is economists speak to say that most of the drop right now is because we have more and more women than ever at 0 children. But conditional on having one child, the average number of children in the US families has been roughly constant at 2.1 since the early 1970s. So what type of things we need to do from my perspective to fix this? And that goes also a little bit to John Cochran's point about what is happening. We really have many, many, many more women that are at 0. And I think that a lot of it has to do with affordable housing. And yes, part of it is cheaper, but also we want more convenient housing. And that includes in terms of size. So unfortunately, one of the areas where the academic left, if I might say so in this way, has gained a 99.9999% of dominance is in anything related with city planning and architecture. And all urban planners are convinced that you need to live in a high rise in very high density with a small size. And that's the worst thing you can imagine for fertility. We also need to think about in issues like transportation, etc. And as I say over there, modern city planning is deeply anti-family and deeply anti-kids. And I have had the fortune or misfortune of talking with a few urban planners and actually be quite amazed about what they think the future of family life should be. I also have emphasized changes in education. At this moment, I believe that the internal rate of return of studying a humanities degree in nearly 99% of the universities in the US is probably negative. I think we are overeducating many people, and that by overeducating them, we are delaying the moment where they can get into the job market, and we are also complicating the matching between men and women. So anything that reduces what I think is a little bit the overinvestment in education along some dimensions, not all, but along some dimensions in the US right now will help also with fertility. So let me conclude over here. I only want to say there's way more I could have told you about this. I could perfectly fill one whole semester talking about these things. I have not even scratched the surface of many topics, but misquoting Bob Lucas, and I hope John Cochran will forgive me for that since he was his former colleague, once you start thinking about these issues, it's hard to think about anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. That was great. We have three. So the first, Armando. And if you guys can be concise, that would be great because we have 5 questions. So please, Armando.
Thank you. So good to meet you virtually. I was the person who has the question about the difference between the national and the global population. Okay. But I noticed that all of the things that you mentioned in the previous slide, all of them were about the national population or fertility rate. So I still will want to hear what really is the special problem that happens when the whole world is not in replacement rather than just the nations that you have identified in your analysis.
So the whole problem, let me go back to this point about sponge cities, is we may be in a situation where a lot of the countries that are experiencing collapsing population and are relatively poor, everyone will like to actually move to the rich countries. Because the rate of return of moving to the rich countries is going to be even larger than before. Okay? Think about Japan has been able to more or less handle this big demographic challenge because Japan is a very homogeneous society with a lot of quote-unquote social capital and institutional resilience. What is going to happen with Brazil when Brazil starts losing a lot of population? This is going to have absolutely ripple effects through the whole Brazilian society that are going to be exacerbated, as I was saying before, by people realizing maybe this is the best time ever to leave Brazil and try to move to the US. And that's the type of effects at the global level that I think are going to be important. Other type of effects at the global level, well, we may just end up, the whole planet may end up looking a little bit like Japan, a whole planet with very, very low economic growth. And as I was saying before, in countries that have very high public debt obligations, countries that have big welfare state commitments, that's going to have very negative consequences for all these countries.
Okay. Elizabeth Foma.
Hi, this is really enjoyable. I don't know if it's possible to model this, but and it may sound sort of behavioralist, but social contagion, I think, is an enormous part of fertility. Yes. I was in the beginning of my PhD program, a time when nobody considers having kids, when my sister got pregnant, and that influenced me to get pregnant. Mormon families, not only are they do women grow up helping to raise other children, but they know when they have children, they're going to have help. And there's a community. My daughter has a child now, and knowing women who have children the same age as yours is incredibly important. And it also, I think, influences the time that you have kids. You have to start earlier, as people have mentioned in the comments. And I think that part of that is contagion. You have to start earlier. And what we see now in sort of the elite circles and in developed countries is that you're seeing your friends start to have a kid at 35, which is like the geriatric fertility cutoff. So this someone needs to model social contagion as a huge part of the process.
Yeah, so if I may brag a little bit about one of my papers, I have, I think, a nice paper by with Nessie Gunner, who is at Cenfi, and Matt Deventhal, who is at Southern California, and we talk a lot about social contagion. Okay, so think about a Barrow-Becker model of quality-quantity trade-off, but where you care about the quality and the quantity of your children, but you also care about who is in your social network. And the way I pitch that paper when I'm giving a presentation is that you want to spend Saturday night with your friends, and there are two equilibria. One equilibrium is you spend Saturday night with your friends at the pub, and the second equilibrium is you spend Saturday night with your friends watching your kids playing baseball. And the problem that we may have had in many countries, especially in the advanced world, is that we have switched from the second equilibrium, spending time with your friends, watching your kids play baseball, to the first one, spending time with your friends at the pub. So in that sense, I'm relatively optimistic that policies that help families are going to help us going back to more reasonable fertility rates of around 1.9. So in that sense, I fully agree with you that this peer group effect is very important, and that's a margin that we need to work in terms of policy decisions. So fully agree with you. Okay, should I try to go over some of the questions I haven't answered in the chat?
We have a couple more questions. We have three more questions. You wanna take the three more questions? So John, then Jonathan, and then Riti.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Of course, the optimum question, I'm sure you're aware of Chad Jones's idea, maximize total utility, and we should have 100 billion people. But you mentioned one very interesting margin, the conditional uncoupling. People are still having kids. The problem is they're not coupling, and it's fascinating that Tinder didn't help that. The other interesting margin, I'm aware that once women hit 30, they're having kids at the same rate as they used to. They're just delaying tremendously. And so that's an interesting margin. If you could only bring it back earlier so that, Beth's buddies all had kids in grad school, then you might actually, so that margin's much easier than the no kids at all margin. And social contagion, of course, is an amplifying effect, but it's not really a shock.
Yes. So let me take all those three questions in turn. So the first one is yes, I fully agree. And so the type of things I have in mind that may have affected this coupling, one of them is the following, and this is particularly relevant for the US. I think that we introduced a lot of changes in our educational system over the last 40 years. Some of those changes are good, but I think that some of those changes have been particularly bad for boys. And this has been particularly bad for around 20-25% of boys at the bottom of the distribution, which means that at this moment, there is around 20% of men who are young men in particular, who are unable to hold steady jobs and who basically want to spend their whole life smoking dope and playing video games. And you see that very clearly in the data. So the problem that you are having is that I think at this moment, think about this as a search and matching model. You have less people on one side of the market. So it's much harder to get coupling.
Jesus, there's also incentives there.
No, and of course.
Actually, birth control is the elephant in the room here.
Yeah.
It used to be if you were a young boy, you needed to get married to have sex. And if you wanted to convince a woman to marry you, you needed to get an education.
Sure. And you could argue that it's not only the bill, it's also the pill, is also the relaxation of social norms. But as a counter argument to that, John, I will tell you that all the evidence that we have is that young people are having sex at the lowest possible rate since the 1950s in the US. Okay, so it's not that people are having fun in college and not getting married because there are no consequences of having fun. Is that probably the average number of sexual encounters that a Penn undergrad is having in 2025 is the lowest since the early 1950s. And that's not because of the pill. And I think it has to do with a lot of other things like social media, etc. And in particular, I think it also has to do with an asymmetry in the matching market right now. The second point that you were making was, can we get people to marry or partner earlier? Fully agree with you, and that's precisely why I have these 2 points. What do you need to partner? Well, you first of all need to have a house. That's my point number 1. And second, you need to be in a situation where education is not in their way. And education may not be in their way either because we redesign graduate programs or undergraduate programs in a way that it makes easier for having children earlier, or because, as I was mentioning before, we realize we don't really need 90% of the people who are getting a master's in psychology in the US right now. So on those, I fully agree with you. And the last point is about how this is the multiplier effect of multiplicity or the peer group effect. I fully agree with you. We are not going to have that. We are not going to coordinate to a higher fertility equilibrium just by telling people to do so. But that's why I think that 1 and 2, if we push the incentives a little bit, the effect can be larger than some people have forecast, precisely because we are going to have this multiplier effect going in the right direction.
We're a bit out of time, but Jonathan and Reading, if you guys want to ask quick questions, maybe.
Well, let me ask the following, which is, first of all, thank you very much for an outstanding talk. It was fantastic. But more importantly, all the points you spoke about in the talk, a lot of it is clearly politically motivated. And destructively politically motivated, or all correct. With that said, we see population declines when people get rich all over the world, long before we started with political thing, long before the pill. This is just a standard thing. When people get rich, they have less kids. Why? It doesn't seem like we could solve this problem unless we really understand why is it that when people get rich, they have less kids.
Okay, so I actually disagree. And the reason I disagree is, yes, we know that as countries grow, you are having this type of phenomenon. Okay, yes, you have a fall in total fertility rate. What is surprising is that there has been this acceleration around 2016. Now, an economist like me will tell you this big drop is the standard quality-quantity trade-off. As we get rich, the relative price of high-quality kids drops, the relative price of low-quality kids increases, and we have fewer kids with higher quality. The reason why...
You really think that that's the explanation? I mean, that seems to me forget about the fact what's happened recently. That catastrophic drop you see in every country in the world. You really think that is just... What?
No. Let me show you this table.
Right, yeah.
Let me show you this table. Now, tell me if this is about getting rich, why Tunisia, that is 12% of the income per capita of the US, has a lower total fertility rate than the US. Or tell me,
Tunisia is a lot richer now than it was 50 years ago, and no?
A little bit, but the point is Tunisia is poorer now than it was the US at the moment of independence. And the moment of independence, the US had a fertility rate of 7. Tell me why Egypt is dropping like a stone. And I'm going to tell you something even more interesting. For the first time in the last 20 years, the income fertility slope in the US and in the United Kingdom has changed. For the first time since the 17th century, now the richer you are in the US, the more kids you have. The people who are not having kids in the US right now are the poor, not the rich. And this is very easy to tell in Philadelphia, all the school closures are happening in the very poor areas. In fact, in the US, since around 2022, for the first time ever, the fertility of non-Hispanic whites has overtaken the fertility of African Americans. Again, for the longest time, African Americans were having way more kids than non-Hispanic whites. Now it's the other way around. It's a little bit lower, but just a little bit lower. So a very simple story. The rich do not have kids. As we get rich, we have fewer kids, just doesn't explain the data. So no, this is not, I'm going to draw a line on the sun. That doesn't explain the data. Now, getting rich explains you why the US did this, but it doesn't explain you, no, maybe over here, explain you how the US transitioned in the 19th and 20th century, but it's not explaining at all what we are seeing right now. Because what we are seeing right now is not people getting rich and stopping having kids.
Tim, and then Jeff.
Hello, Professor Jesus. I don't know if you remember me from 2.5 years ago, but I was actually in your class.
Okay, sorry about that.
And you had a wonderful slide on Nehru, which and how he should have started more schools and primary schools, and that got me thinking. And now I'm back in India in politics. But my question is about India, and I'm obviously not an academic, but in terms of policy decisions around young people, what do you think is the implication for India? What's the advice for India? And also, what's the advice for young people in India? I obviously can't affect much, but I can go talk to people about this and try to push it forward. But what's your advice for India in terms of demographics?
Yeah, so India is a very complicated country to give demographic advice. And the reason is the following. You go to Kerala, and the fertility rate in Kerala right now is probably around 1.3, way lower than the United States. It's basically, Kerala right now is at the level of Italy or Spain, but you go to Uttar Pradesh, it's at still 2.5, 2.4. So you are in the funny situation where you probably want to lower fertility in Uttar Pradesh. I think that 2.5 is bad or 2.4 is bad for long-run growth, but probably increase it in Kerala. And that's a really, really difficult double act to play simultaneously. So exactly how you do that, I guess you will need to continue with issues like promotion of gender equality and primary education in the north of India, and then switch in the south to issues like better housing and more balance of work and life. But certainly at this moment, if I were in charge of population politics in India, I will be extremely concerned that I'm in some sense in the worst situation with too much fertility in parts of my country or too high fertility and too low fertility in the other part of the country.
Yes, last question.
Thanks, and sorry for asking a question so late and holding you over late. This was a fantastic talk. One word that I did not hear at all in any question or in the talk was the word feminism and the possibility that the drop in fertility, which I think is mainly determined by women, is related to certain feminist ideas and the spread of those ideas, in particular ideas about what the good life entails. The good life doesn't entail family. The good life entails other things. I would note that sharp drop that you that you didn't have an explanation for in 2016 coincides with around the time that smartphones were widely adopted around the world, and one could around the world, or some of these notions and ideas that were mainly Western notions, Western feminist notions and ideas really spread around the world.
Yeah, no, this is sure. In the longer version of this talk, I talk quite a bit about social media and social norms. And this is, for instance, the view of one of a good friend and Alice Evans. And basically what Ali says is exactly what you say, that for the first time, a woman living in Egypt is able to use her cell phone to get around family supervision and get exposed to ideas about social norms and gender norms and family norms that come from the Western world and do not fit very well with the institutions of Egypt. And I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just looking at this as a researcher, and that's having a very, very accelerated effect on her fertility decisions. And so along that dimension, I think there is quite a bit to say about that. Unfortunately today, because I only have 80 minutes, I didn't really get too much into the reasons of why this is going on. The only thing I will say is that the jury is still out. I think it's a plausible hypothesis. Alice is trying to write a book on it, and I'll be sure I tell her to send you a copy as soon as the book is out.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you. This was fascinating. Thank you, everybody.
Of course, thanks.
Great talk.
So Jesus, somebody want.
Yeah. No, I only wanted to mention that if there was any question I couldn't address, feel free to send me an email, and I will happy to address it by email.
Yeah, Maria Tubi actually was asking.
I might do that, Jesus. I mean, it's really been a very, very educational talk. I will say that I was sympathetic. I really think that somebody should be looking carefully at the correlates, because I think that you are overly conservative in believing the UN data. I think that the UN data, as you point out, is heavily politically motivated. The numbers are, people don't in these third world countries, they don't report deaths and births. And if you look at food, because food is part of, if you misreport that, your government numbers are wrong, your taxes are wrong.
Yes,
that's probably more accurately measured.
Yeah, no, I know. I just don't want to oversell my case either. So when I teach in US economic history, I show students, undergrads, this letter from an Irish person that is working for the US Railroad. He was probably working for Lynn and Stanford. And he doesn't know how to read and write, so he's dictating the letter to a scriber that will send it back home to the old country in Ireland. And he's saying, oh, the US Pacific is, we make so much money in the US that they give us meat twice a week. And the scriber says, what do you mean meat twice a week? You get meat every day. And he says, well, but in Ireland, no one will believe that. They will think I'm making it up. So instead of saying I'm eating meat 7 days a week, I tell them it's 2, which is already as much as they think plausible. So that's a little bit the way I think about it. Okay, just correct a little bit in the most plausible scenario, and you get a completely different change view of what is happening with the planet.
So the UN putting their fingers on the data is kind of a scandalous story you've got here.
I know. And the UN is absolutely outrageous.
Well,
did you read a book by Jerusalem?
Excuse me, sorry?
Go ahead, German.
And the thing that worries me about this is the extent to which the UN is completely corrupted. The World Health Organization is corrupted. The aid agencies are corrupted.
Yes.
The data is corrupted. And, it's outrageous.
No, I fully
agree. Corrupted.
Yeah, no, but I fully agree. But I actually, here is a situation where I'm going to say is worse than you think. Okay, what do I mean is worse than you think? If the United Nations comes up with some forecast about the US economy, no one is paying any attention. But if you are in Colombia and you are trying to say, oh, the data is very different from what the UN says, you are just a poor academic, probably without much credibility because the universities in Colombia are not very good. And you are trying to fight against the United Nations, which is this great institution. And you just cannot make it. I remember I knew this friend, and her father, he was an important businessman, but he didn't know much about academia. And so he asked me, oh, you got a job at Penn. You know, if you want, I know someone at the United Nations, maybe they can hire you as an economist at the United Nations. he thought that, you know, getting hired as an economist at the United Nations was a substantial upgrade with respect to being a professor at Penn. And that's what I'm trying to say, that you go to many countries in the third world and the United Nations carries so much prestige and so much weight that it's very difficult to have a policy discussion, because when you say this data doesn't fit what I observe, you have zero credibility.
I know. I have to go, but thank you again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Marianne, you wanted to ask something quick about the table?
Hi, this is Marianne Tupi from Human Progress / Cato Institute. Thanks, fantastic presentation. Just a quick question about Table 1. I already emailed you about it, but basically I'm just asking what the units are.
Okay, so what is Table 1?
That was, can Japan do it? Or something like that. Hold on a second. Japan is doing very well. I think it's page number 38.
Oh, okay. Yes. Is growth per year. So 0.83 means that Japan between 1991 and 2019 has been growing 0.83% a year.
Okay, so all of these are percentages?
Percentages, all of them.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's economist bias.
Okay. Okay, well, super interesting.
Thank you.
Super interesting. Thank you so much. So everything is in percentages, all of them. Okay, good.
Thank
you.
In that table, everything is a percentage, yes.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So did you read, Jesus, sorry, Jose, the book by Geruso and Spear? They have this book, they just published a book called Spike. I don't know. Did you like it?
Yeah, it's not a bad book. It's actually
okay.
The only reason why I haven't written my book yet is because I'm a little bit concerned. I maybe like the competition. I think I can write a better book. They tend to be a little bit, let me put it in this way, they are trying to make a case a little bit to the academic left that people are good.
Right.
I don't think I need to make that case. I think it should be self-obvious that people are good and they are not parasites on Earth. And the book doesn't have much on aggregate issues like growth and development terms. But it's not a bad book. I mean, I will be more than happy to give the book to an undergrads and let him.
I mean, you're right. It's definitely a book that is making the case that this issue shouldn't be a taboo, even to left-wing liberals. So I think that they go out of their way to sort of present the argument in a way that is not going to offend sensibilities.
Yeah, exactly. And as I was telling you, so what happened in Colorado was the following. So University of Colorado has this kind keynote address, blah, 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 blah. And they invite me to give the keynote address. And it's supposed to be for the general public. So I said, look, I'm not going to give them a talk on deep learning. So I send this one. And, I think this is a nice talk for general audience. I have given it in many universities and it was always well received. But turns out to be the case that in the board of directors of whoever is approving this thing, and I had already set up the date and everything, but someone in the board of directors is in the sociology department. And she looks at the presentation, she looks at it and says, well, you know what the problem is? Someone coming out of this talk is going to suddenly be more likely to support abortion restrictions.
Right. That's a concern, right. Exactly.
And that's it. And they cancel the talk.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, yeah, that's incredible.
I mean, it's the same talk I just gave today. Do you think there is anything anyone can take offense on what I say today?
Right. I mean, no, it's just mild and it's just facts. And, I don't see any controversial political statements. I think I make 3 or 4 more controversial political statements per day.
I know this talk. I actually gave this talk at the sociology department at Penn, and everyone was like, "Yeah, fine."
Right. No, that's incredible. Like, how can people be so sensitive? But by going back to this book, one of the things I found about the book is that they talk about the issue, but you read the book and you feel we have no idea what's driving this thing.
Yeah.
That was sort of my conclusion, that there's so much uncertainty about the drivers. I mean, they even make the claim that the one-child policy actually didn't have a huge effect in China's fertility. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I actually think, okay, let me show you the following. Sorry to keep you waiting. If you need to run, just let me know, okay? But
the people already run, so.
No, I mean you like in Ivan.
Right.
Okay, look. And demographics, oh no, where do I have it? No, actually, one amazing thing, and that's probably number one in favor of Chile. Oh, let me show you this one. These are the
Chile's
fertility
scary, yeah,
rates
you're
in
right.
Chile by region. Man, over
Right.
here, 93. Well, fine. But let me see if I find them. I think they may be in figures. Well, I will try to search them later. But what I do is the following. I have maybe Taiwan. Let me search this. China, Taiwan. Okay, over here. This is the TFR of Taiwan. This is the TFR of China. The one kid, one child policy was introduced here in 1980. So if you look at
completely
it,
relevant.
exactly. But the most amazing thing of all is the following. If you put over here, you add the TFR of Chinese in Malaysia, like a third line, the TFR of Chinese in Singapore, and the TFR of Chinese Americans, they are all four of them on top of each other.
They're the same, so very cultural.
Yep. Something about maybe their obsession with education, but the fact, the amazing fact is that a Chinese American in Philadelphia behaves much more like a Chinese in Shanghai than his Protestant neighbors in terms of fertility.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
And to me, as you know, as a Minnesota Barrow Becker maximize utility rational expectation guy, you know, that's a shock.
Right. It's culture at the end of the day. Wow, incredible. No, very interesting talk and very big problem, obviously. I mean, it's interesting because in Chile, you know, we have this incredibly low fertility rate. It's the one thing nobody talks about in Chile at all. Obviously, not even the right wing is willing to talk about it. Championing women's rights, and for some reason they see this as strong contradiction between championing women's rights and being sustainable. We should talk about sustainability.
I know. So I gave this interview. I don't know if you can see it, for El Mercurio a few months ago.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, right.
And again, it all completely flat. No one thought it was very, very interesting.
They don't talk about it, and you know, it's very interesting how the agenda is completely ignoring that issue, even though it seems like an urgent issue in Chile. But anyway, yeah. It was great, Jesus. Thanks a lot again. I mean, it would have been nice to have you here in person, but hopefully we'll get you in the spring.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.